The hospital lobby was quiet that morning, filled with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the shuffle of early patients. Dr. Gerald Whitman, a renowned cardiac surgeon, walked briskly toward the elevator, coffee in hand, already annoyed by a minor delay in the OR schedule. As he neared the receptionist's desk, he noticed a man standing silently near the wall, dark-skinned, neatly dressed, but clearly out of place. Whitman narrowed his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, tone clipped. The man smiled politely, about to answer when Gerald suddenly turned away, dismissing him as another lost immigrant. The man hadn't moved. Gerald glanced over his shoulder again, irritated. "This is a restricted area. You can't loiter here," he barked. The receptionist, flustered, looked up but said nothing. "Speak English, do you understand?" Gerald snapped. The man responded, calmly, "I do. I'm just waiting." Without warning, Gerald stepped closer, lowered his voice, and said something cruel, before spitting on the man's shoes. Gasps echoed in the lobby. A nurse dropped her clipboard. The man's expression didn't change. He simply nodded as if he expected it. Then he said quietly, "Thank you, doctor. I'll be seeing you again. Very soon." Gerald stormed away, shaking his head. "Security should clean this place up," he muttered. Back in the surgical suite, he bragged about the incident. Some guy just loitering in the lobby couldn't even speak properly, probably looking for free healthcare. His colleagues laughed nervously, uncertain how to respond. Gerald, brilliant but arrogant, had a reputation. He didn't tolerate mistakes, delays, or, as many whispered, minorities. Yet, he was protected by his performance record and his donors. In private meetings, the board even referred to him as untouchable. No one dared challenge the surgeon who brought in millions. But something was off that week. Rumors swirled about major leadership changes. Nurses whispered in break rooms. Department heads exchanged cautious glances. "The new medical director starts Monday," someone said. "From out of state, impressive background, Harvard, Mayo, humanitarian work in Mexico." Gerald scoffed. "I've heard that story before. Bet it's some bureaucrat with no clue." What goes on in real hospitals? His assistant brought a memo for him to sign. At the bottom, he noticed a name, Dr. Santiago Ibarra. "Mexican, of course," he muttered, tossing it aside. "Let's see how long he lasts." Monday came with an unexpected buzz of tension. Staff lined the halls near the administration wing. Cameras were being set up for a brief introduction. Gerald, in scrubs, passed by without interest. "Political theater," he said. But when the doors opened and the new director walked in, silence fell like a stone. It was the man Gerald had spit on. Clean-shaven, now in a tailored navy suit, calm and composed, Dr. Santiago Ibarra. He walked to the podium, thanked everyone, graciously, and began to speak. Gerald froze in place. His heart thudded in his chest. Santiago's speech was short. He spoke fluent, clear English. "I believe hospitals are sacred spaces," he said. "Places where healing should be offered without arrogance, where dignity must always come before pride. We all have blind spots, including me." The words were carefully chosen, layered with meaning. Gerald stared, jaw clenched. The room erupted, into applause, but he remained still. He didn't tell anyone what had happened in the lobby, not yet, but others were beginning to connect the dots. A few nurses exchanged looks. One even whispered, "Wasn't that the guy from last week?" Later that day, a staff-wide meeting was held. Dr. Ibarra sat at the head of the table. Gerald, slumped in his seat, arms crossed. Every word Santiago spoke felt like a quiet challenge, not directly confrontational, but piercing. "We will be evaluating patient outcomes more holistically," Santiago said. "Leadership will no longer be measured only by statistics, but by compassion, collaboration, and accountability." Gerald rolled his eyes. "Here comes the soft stuff," he murmured. But something gnawed at him. Santiago hadn't mentioned the incident. Why not? Was he waiting? Planning? Or worse, forgiving him? That evening, Gerald received an email from the board. Mandatory one-on-one with Dr. Ibarra, it read. Thursday, 9 a.m. He stared at it for a full minute. Was this it? Would he be exposed? Fired? As much as he hated to admit it, part of him felt something else. Shame, a rare and unwelcome feeling. For the first time in years, Gerald couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the man's face, not angry, just patient. And the words echoed back. I'll be seeing you again, very soon. He had no idea just how soon. Thursday arrived, and Gerald dressed with more care than usual. No coffee, no swagger, just tension in every step as he approached the executive wing. Outside Dr. Ibarra's office, the secretary nodded. He's expecting you. Gerald walked in, half expecting a lecture or reprimand. Instead, Santiago stood, offered his hand, and smiled. Dr. Whitman, thank you for coming. Gerald hesitated before shaking it. The touch was firm but gentle. Please, Santiago said, gesturing to a chair. Let's talk. No mention of the lobby, no visible resentment, just professionalism, and something else Gerald couldn't quite name. Grace, maybe. Or control. Santiago started with questions about cardiac surgical protocols, patient volume, interdepartmental cooperation. Gerald answered stiffly at first, then more freely. Your outcomes are excellent, Santiago said, but I've read several staff reports citing interpersonal concerns. Gerald tensed. I expect excellence. Hospitals aren't daycares. Santiago nodded. True, but people perform best in environments where they're respected. Gerald looked away. Silence fell. Then Santiago added, I know you're wondering why I haven't brought up what happened. Gerald turned slowly. His stomach sank. Because I believe people are more than their worst moments, Santiago said softly, but accountability still matters. Gerald opened his mouth to defend himself, but stopped. He didn't know what to say. You didn't know who I was, Santiago continued, but that shouldn't matter. Gerald looked down. It was a mistake. Santiago raised an eyebrow. Was it? Gerald flinched. He didn't answer. Santiago nodded once. This conversation isn't punishment, it's an invitation. You've built a legacy here. You could also shape its future, but only if you're willing to examine who you've become and who you want to be. Gerald didn't respond. Santiago stood. Take the weekend, reflect, then tell me if you're still willing to lead. Gerald left the office in a daze. The encounter hadn't gone the way he'd expected. No threats, no reprimands. But the weight of it pressed harder than any punishment. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, untouched dinner in front of him, staring into space. Memories flooded back. Medical school, the sacrifices, the long nights. But also the coldness he'd adopted, the contempt he'd shown, the privileges he'd stopped noticing. For the first time in years, he opened his old journals. In one, he had written, Never forget why you started. To save lives, not dominate them. By Sunday, something in Gerald had shifted. He wasn't sure what it was yet. Shame, maybe, or the beginning of humility. On Monday morning, he walked into the staff lounge and nodded at a nurse he'd barely acknowledged before. Morning, Tasha. She blinked in surprise. Good morning, doctor. Call me Gerald. She smiled faintly. It was a small thing, but it felt enormous. Later, during a meeting on surgical rotations, Gerald listened more than he spoke. When two interns presented a new idea, he didn't interrupt. He asked questions, encouraged them. Something was softening, slowly, awkwardly, but undeniably. That afternoon, Gerald passed by the palliative care wing and saw Dr. Ibarra speaking gently to a terminal patient's family. He paused, watching. Santiago sat low, eye level with the young girl in the chair. His tone was soft, steady, his words patient. The girl asked a question. Santiago paused thoughtfully before answering. No rush, no evasion. Gerald felt something stir. Not envy, not even admiration, something deeper. A recognition of what true leadership looked like. It wasn't dominance, it was presence. He walked away, unsure of himself for the first time in years, but also more curious than ever. That evening, Gerald stood alone in the OR balcony, watching a junior team handle a complex procedure. He noticed every detail: teamwork, communication, empathy. He realized how often he'd bulldozed through moments like these, assuming only he had the answers. A voice behind him broke the silence. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Santiago stood beside him. "They're good," Gerald admitted. "Better than I expected." Santiago smiled. "They've been trained well, but they thrive when seen." Gerald didn't reply. Santiago continued. "Healing isn't just physical, Gerald. It's also cultural, systemic, personal." And with that, he walked away, leaving Gerald alone with his thoughts. That night, Gerald sat with his wife, something he hadn't done in weeks. She noticed. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Just thinking about the kind of doctor I've been, and the kind I want to be." She put her hand on his. "It's not too late." Gerald exhaled. He felt like he was standing on the edge of something new, terrifying, uncertain, but vital. And in the background of his mind, Santiago's voice lingered. People are more than their worst moments. Gerald didn't know what the next days would bring, but for the first time, he wanted to find out. Tuesday morning began with tension. The hospital's internal newsletter published a profile on Dr. Santiago Ibarra. New director, brings vision, precision, and heart. The article listed his impressive credentials: Harvard Medical School, surgical missions in underserved regions, published research on inclusive patient care. But it was the final paragraph that caught Gerald's eye. It mentioned Santiago's advocacy for neurodivergent professionals in medicine. "As someone on the spectrum, I've often experienced the world differently," Santiago had said. Gerald blinked. Spectrum? Suddenly, Santiago's calm, measured tone, his deliberate speech, his ability to absorb insult without retaliation, it all made a different kind of sense. Still, not everyone welcomed Santiago's leadership. Whispers spread that he was too soft, too political, not one of us. Gerald found himself at a crossroads. He could quietly align with the resistance, or he could begin to speak up. That morning, in a meeting about surgical triage protocols, a senior colleague made a snide remark. "Let's not get too sentimental. We're doctors, not therapists." Gerald paused, then replied, "Actually, emotional safety improves performance. We're better surgeons when people aren't afraid to speak up." The room fell silent. No one expected Whitman, of all people, to say that. News of Gerald's comment spread quickly. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. Tasha, the nurse, from earlier, approached him during rounds. "I heard what you said in the meeting." Gerald nodded. "Still figuring things out?" She smiled. "We all are, but people notice effort." Gerald felt a strange warmth in her words. He hadn't been used to kindness without strings. That evening, he wrote a personal note to Santiago, just a few lines. "Thank you for the conversation. I'm thinking differently now. I'd like to talk again, if you're willing." He hovered over the send button, then clicked. No reply came that night. Wednesday brought a patient emergency. A woman in her 40s was rushed into surgery after a heart valve ruptured. Gerald was on call. As he scrubbed in, he noticed Santiago standing in the observation gallery. Their eyes met briefly. The operation was intense. Midway through, a new intern dropped an instrument. Gerald paused. Normally, he would have snapped, but he breathed, nodded, and said, "Pick it up. Glove again. Stay focused." The room held its breath. The intern followed instructions. Surgery continued. Hours later, after saving the woman's life, Gerald looked up again. Santiago was still there. watching. Then, finally, he nodded. The following day, Santiago called for another staff-wide meeting. This time, the topic was implicit bias in clinical settings. A few doctors rolled their eyes. Gerald remained silent. Santiago's tone was factual, not moralizing. He used data, case studies, anonymous complaints. Then, gently, he said, "Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a raised eyebrow, a patient's accent, a mispronounced name, a door that closes slightly harder." Gerald thought of his past, the way he'd dismissed others, minimized their experiences. And now, here he was, listening, not defending, not deflecting, just listening. And slowly, it was changing something deep inside him. That afternoon, Gerald was surprised to receive a visit from Dr. Ibarra. "Walk with me?" Santiago asked. They stepped outside into the garden courtyard. For a moment, neither spoke. "I got your message," Santiago said. "I didn't reply because I wanted to see if you really meant it." Gerald nodded. "I did. I do." Santiago looked at him. "Why the change?" Gerald exhaled. "Because I saw you treat people the way I wish I had, because I'm tired of being feared, and because I think I've lost part of myself along the way." Santiago's face softened. "That's a good place to begin." Their conversation grew deeper. Gerald asked about Santiago's work abroad, his advocacy, even his diagnosis. "It's level 1 autism," Santiago explained. "Most people don't notice, unless they're looking. I mask well, but it's exhausting sometimes." Gerald hesitated. "Can I ask, does that affect how you lead?" Santiago nodded. "It forces me to be intentional. I read situations differently, so I've had to study people, patterns, motivations. I don't always get nuance, but I notice what others miss." Gerald found himself surprised, not by the answer, but by how much sense it made. Santiago's calm, his discipline, it wasn't weakness. Later that week, a formal complaint arrived from a wealthy patient, angry about being told no to a VIP room request. The case landed on Gerald's desk. The old version of him would have brushed it off. But this time, he reviewed the details. The patient had tried to jump the queue, displacing a woman recovering from chemotherapy. Gerald called Santiago. "The right call was made," he said. "But you should know, this guy's on the donor list." Santiago replied, "Integrity first, every time." Gerald smiled faintly. "Glad to hear it." That call marked something subtle, not just respect, but alignment. Friday came with an unexpected surprise. The hospital board invited Gerald to deliver a short talk at the annual donor gala. He was puzzled. "Why me?" he asked Santiago. "Because they respect your outcomes," Santiago said, "and I want them to see your growth." Gerald felt nervous. Public speaking wasn't his forte, not anymore. But Santiago added, "Just speak honestly. That's what they'll remember." That night, standing before a ballroom of philanthropists, doctors, and executives, Gerald cleared his throat and began. "For years, I thought healing was about control, but lately, I've learned it's more about humility." The room went quiet. He continued, "I'm not proud of every moment in my career, but I'm grateful for the ones that woke me up." A few people looked at each other. This year, our hospital didn't just gain a new director. We gained a vision, one that sees every patient, every staff member, and yes, even doctors, not just for their performance, but their potential. Applause followed, not thunderous, but warm. That night, Santiago approached him quietly. "You spoke well," he said. Gerald shrugged. "I just told the truth." Santiago smiled. "That's always enough." For the first time, Gerald believed it, but not everyone was pleased. Whispers of backlash emerged. A senior surgeon, known for his connections to hospital donors, cornered Gerald in the parking lot. "Don't get too comfortable. This inclusion fad won't last. Men like us built this place." Gerald didn't flinch. "Then we should be the first to protect it from arrogance." The man scoffed and walked away. Gerald stood there, under the flickering light, heart pounding, not from fear, but from resolve. He was no longer protecting his turf. He was standing for something larger than himself, and he realized he didn't miss the old version of him. The next day, Santiago stopped by Gerald's office. "I heard what you said in the parking lot," he said. Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Word travels fast." Santiago nodded. "Especially when the old guard starts to panic." They both laughed, a brief, genuine sound. Santiago's voice turned thoughtful. "Change always provokes resistance, but it also reveals allies." Gerald asked, "Do you think I can really change?" Santiago replied, "You already are. And it's not about perfection, it's about direction." Gerald leaned back in his chair, letting that sink in. He hadn't expected this season of his life to be about reinvention. That evening, as he walked through the hospital, Gerald paused by a young resident struggling with a chart. "Need help?" he asked. The resident looked startled. Yeah, thank you." Gerald sat beside her, guiding her through the process. Across the hallway, a nurse whispered to another, "That's Whitman." The other replied, "He's changed." Gerald overheard, but said nothing. He just kept helping. It felt right. As he left the ward, he glanced at the directory sign, Dr. Santiago Ibarra, Medical Director. He smiled. The title now felt like a shield, not for Santiago, but for the culture they were building. Still, one question haunted Gerald. Why hadn't Santiago ever mentioned the lobby incident? Why no rebuke? Why no revenge? That night, he asked directly, "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Santiago looked at him. "Because I don't lead with bitterness. I lead with vision. You're not my enemy, Gerald. You're part of the solution, if you choose to be." Gerald felt his throat tighten. In that moment, he understood. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's strategy. It's leadership. It's hope. And Santiago, brilliant, steady, quiet Santiago, was exactly the kind of leader the hospital had always needed but never expected. Week later, the hospital held its quarterly performance review, a closed-door meeting with top leadership, department heads, and the board. Santiago opened with transparency, celebrating improvements, addressing blind spots, proposing new metrics that emphasized empathy and ethics as much as efficiency. When it was Gerald's turn to speak, he stood slowly and said, "For most of my career, I believed the only thing that mattered was surgical outcomes, but I've learned that the human outcomes matter just as much." The room fell silent. Santiago glanced at him, a quiet affirmation passing between them. Change, once unthinkable, was happening. After the meeting, Gerald lingered by the coffee station, lost in thought. A junior doctor approached him, a young man named Luis, born in Mexico, now in residency. "Dr. Whitman," he said nervously, "can I say something?" Gerald nodded. Luis continued, "A year ago, I wouldn't have dared speak in meetings, but now I feel like I belong, and I think that's because of how you changed." Gerald's throat tightened. He wasn't used to gratitude. "Thank you," he said. As Luis walked away, Gerald looked out the window. The view was the same, but the world somehow felt different now. The next Monday, an email circulated from Santiago's office. An anonymous patient satisfaction report included a complaint. A senior doctor had once dismissed a patient's request for a translator, assuming they wouldn't understand the diagnosis anyway. Gerald read the words with a pit in his stomach. That was him. Months ago, before everything changed. He hadn't remembered the moment, but now he couldn't forget it. Santiago didn't mention names in the staff huddle. Instead, he said, "The difference between neglect and cruelty is often just silence. Let's be better than that." Gerald felt the message strike home, deep and sharp. He found Santiago in the cafeteria later that day. "It was me," Gerald confessed. "That patient who asked for a translator. I didn't mean to," Santiago interrupted gently. "I know." Gerald stared at him. "Why didn't you say anything?" Santiago folded his hands. "Because The fact that you're here, owning it, means more than public shame ever could. Gerald's eyes welled up. How do you do that? Stay so composed? Santiago smiled faintly. I wasn't always. I've had meltdowns, shutdowns. But I learned to work with how I'm wired, not against it. I've never wanted pity, just purpose. That evening, a last-minute emergency arrived, a teenager with severe cardiac trauma. It was all hands on deck. Gerald stepped in as lead surgeon. The parents were undocumented immigrants, terrified not just of losing their son, but of being reported. Gerald met them outside the OR, knelt to their eye level, and said in Spanish, "We'll do everything we can. You're safe here." The mother burst into tears. The father clasped his hand. Inside the OR, Gerald worked swiftly, focused, compassionate. When the boy's heart stabilized, Gerald closed his eyes and whispered, "Gracias." It wasn't just relief, it was redemption. News of the operation spread quickly through the hospital. Interns recounted how Gerald had stayed afterward to explain the procedures step by step. A nurse shared that he'd thanked the janitor by name. For the first time in years, people weren't avoiding him in hallways. They were approaching him, asking questions, smiling, trusting. At the next staff breakfast, Santiago raised his cup during closing remarks and said, "To those who evolve, who listen, who begin again, even after years of silence." His eyes met Gerald's. A few people clapped. Gerald looked down, not out of shame, but quiet gratitude. A few days later, Gerald was called into a meeting with the hospital board. He feared the worst, but instead, the chairwoman stood and said, "We've watched your journey, and we believe in rewarding not just excellence, but growth. We'd like you to co-lead the next phase of hospital development alongside Dr. Ibarra." Gerald was stunned. "Me?" The chairwoman smiled. "Yes, people follow those who've walked both sides of the fire." Santiago simply nodded, already knowing this would happen. Gerald left that room not puffed with pride, but humbled. For the first time, his leadership felt earned, not inherited. One afternoon, Gerald was asked to guest lecture at a local medical school. He stood before a room of students, many of them immigrants, first-generation scholars, or neurodivergent. He told them his story, not the sanitized resume version, but the truth. "I was wrong," he said. "I let arrogance guide me. But I met someone who taught me what leadership really looks like." A hand went up. What was his title? Gerald smiled. Director, mentor, friend, and, as I learned later, autistic. The room went still, and he leads with more clarity and compassion than any doctor I've ever known. That night, Gerald sat with Santiago in the hospital courtyard. It was quiet, the hum of machines distant. Gerald asked, "Did you always know you'd be a leader?" Santiago shook his head. "I always knew I saw things differently. For years I thought that was a flaw. Now I know it's my strength." Gerald nodded slowly. "I used to think compassion was weakness." Santiago replied, "That's because people confuse loudness with authority. But real strength is quiet and constant." They sat in silence for a while. Gerald looked up at the stars. "I don't know what's ahead, but I'm not afraid anymore." The next morning, the hospital hosted a new campaign launch. Healing Without Borders focused on equitable care for undocumented, neurodivergent, and underserved communities. Gerald gave a speech, but this time he shared the stage with nurses, janitors, even former patients. Santiago closed the event with a single sentence. "Everyone belongs in a place of healing." As the audience applauded, a banner unfurled behind them. It read, "Compassion is our currency, inclusion is our strength." Gerald stood there, hand over heart, realizing this wasn't just Santiago's mission, it had become his too, and it was just the beginning. 2 weeks later, Gerald met a new intern named Mateo. Awkward, brilliant, often misunderstood by staff. Mateo rarely made eye contact, avoided loud rooms, and struggled in fast-paced rounds. Gerald recognized the signs. One afternoon, he invited Matteo to his office. "I know it's not always easy," he said, "but you're not alone. You have support here." Matteo's eyes widened. "I didn't think anyone noticed." Gerald replied, "I see you. I really do." That moment became a turning point for Matteo and for Gerald, because empathy, once foreign to him, had now become his native language. The next crisis came unannounced, a lawsuit from a disgruntled former donor who felt marginalized by the hospital's new policies. The board panicked. Some demanded a public apology. Gerald stood firm. "We will not apologize for compassion." Santiago backed him. Together, they met with attorneys, media, and stakeholders, and while the legal storm eventually passed, the hospital's reputation soared. National outlets praised their leadership model. Gerald was invited to write an op-ed, "How I Unlearned Power and Found Purpose in Medicine." In it, he wrote, "Healing others begins when we allow healing in ourselves. That's the medicine no textbook teaches." On the one-year anniversary of Santiago's appointment, the hospital held a quiet celebration. A hallway was renamed the Ibarra Wing, dedicated to leadership through compassion. Gerald gave a short speech. "There are people who change policies," he said, "and others who change people. Dr. Ibarra did both." Afterward, they walked the hall together. Santiago said softly, "I used to think I didn't belong in places like this." Gerald replied, "You didn't just belong, you built it." Santiago smiled, not with pride, but with peace. He had never needed recognition, only the chance to help others rise. As they walked past the staff lounge, a photo caught Gerald's eye. A candid snapshot of them during a team training session. He paused. "Do I really look that old?" Santiago laughed. "You look evolved." Gerald chuckled. "I'll take it." They continued walking side by side. In a place once ruled by hierarchy and silence, now laughter echoed. Ideas flowed. People belonged. And it wasn't perfect. But it was alive. Gerald never imagined that becoming a better doctor would mean becoming a better man. But now he couldn't separate the two. Medicine had changed because leadership had changed. Weeks passed. Seasons shifted. New interns arrived, old staff retired, and the hospital kept growing. One morning, a young boy arrived with his grandmother. They didn't speak English. The front desk fumbled to find a translator. Gerald walked by, paused, and stepped in. He knelt by the boy and greeted them in Spanish. The boy smiled. The grandmother wept. "Thank you," she whispered. Gerald didn't need applause. That moment, the connection, the dignity, was its own reward. He looked up and saw Santiago watching from down the hall. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They both understood. Back. In his office, Gerald wrote a letter to his medical school alumni journal. "I once believed success was measured in scalpel precision and operating room silence," he began. "But today, I measure it by the trust in a patient's eyes." The voice of an intern unafraid to ask, the janitor who feels respected. Medicine is not just a science, it's a shared humanity. He didn't send it yet, but he saved it. Because now he wrote, not to impress, but to express. And that, he realized, was Santiago's greatest lesson. That dignity is not granted. It is practiced. One afternoon, as Santiago prepared to leave for a conference, he paused at Gerald's door. "Before I go," he said, "I wanted to say, I never expected you to change. But I'm glad you did." Gerald stood up. "I never expected to either." Santiago smiled. "And for the record, I never forgot the lobby incident." Gerald froze. "Then why?" "Because," Santiago said gently, "everyone deserves a chance to grow, even those who once spat at the ground beneath them. Especially them." Then he added, "Autism doesn't make me fragile. It makes me focused. And I saw something in you." Gerald walked Santiago out through the main corridor. Patients, nurses, and doctors moved through the building with quiet purpose. At the sliding glass doors, Santiago turned. "We've built something good here." Gerald nodded. "And we'll keep building." Santiago extended his hand. Gerald took it. No apology, no rehashing, just a quiet acknowledgement of a journey shared. As Santiago disappeared into the sunlight, Gerald stood for a moment, watching. Then he turned back toward the hospital. Not as the surgeon he once was, but as the man he had become. And in every step, there was peace, purpose, and something close to grace.